Hello and welcome to the 72nd episode of the Board Game Barrage podcast. My name is Mark. With me, as always, are my co-hosts Neelan and Kellen. Say hello, guys.
Hello.
Kellen?
Red.
On today's episode, we're not going to be talking about depth. We're not going to be talking about width. We're not going to be talking about length. Kellen, you can make your joke now.
Wait, aren't we talking about
I know
length?
we were talking about length.
Oh, we are talking about length.
What, are you serious?
Oh, no. Oh, I was going to say the fourth dimension is time.
Oh.
But we are talking about length.
Well, we nailed that one.
Oh, well, okay.
That's one for the outro, right,
all
Mark?
right, yeah, that is one for the outro. I think I'm going to keep all this.
That was incredible.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we're talking about length, but we're also talking about the fourth dimension, which is time, which is my joke. But we are talking about length because length is time. It failed. So we're talking about game length. We're talking about, can a game be too long? Can a game be too short? What makes a game too long or too short? And how that affects our enjoyment of games. But before we get into that, let's talk about the games we've been playing. Neelan, what have you been playing?
So I've been playing Dice Forge. This is a game that I was very happy to have picked up in the last math trade.
What a baby game for
Well,
babies.
That was kind of actually, honestly, so I got this as a good bargain. It was like $15 for a game in Shrink.
For your baby.
Yeah, for the many babies I've fathered. But just the conceit of it as like a game that's got these colorful, bright graphics, and there's a game about sort of building dice. It's got this very plastic toy feel to it. I was very apprehensive where I thought like, okay, this will be a fun lark for like a small amount of money. But I actually quite enjoyed this. It's very silly. Let me set this up. So the way this works is, like I said, is a dice crafting game. You sort of have a array of cards, and you start the game with these two dice. And these dice are little plastic shells, or when there are plastic faces that have just been like clipped onto each side of the die. Each face represents a different resource or gold, and then you start each turn of the game by rolling both those dice. So dice. Definitely dice. Die Forge. So you roll those two dice, you get those resources, and then you sort of take an action. And that action can be one of two things. You're either going to buy one of the cards, which is arrayed out on the board, using one of the two main resources, like sun shards or moon shards, I think they are. Or you can buy a new face or multiple faces for either of your dice by spending the gold you've acquired. What you do when you do that, you're literally choosing a little face of a die, which is in this little tray that's laid out, and you pick it, you sort of unclip one of the die faces from your dice, snap the new one back on, and now you've modified your die. That's cool. Like, it's a game where you're like literally modifying dice and building to bigger and better dice so that every time you roll them, you're getting bigger and better things. That sounds like this veneer of a deck builder to it, where you're sort of like improving your resource generation over the course of the game. And then you're sort of doing that in service of collecting cards that will eventually get you victory points. Some of the victory points faces actually just go onto your die, so you could just roll them and get victory points if you wanted to forego resources. And that's basically the gist of the entire game. It's actually incredibly simple in a way that I was, again, after having read the rules, thinking, this can't be good. But something about we've spoken about toy factor a lot recently, and this is toy factor like to the nth degree. Everything is bright and colorful and just beautifully produced. Like, I can't stress this enough. Everything about the game production is incredible, and there's something so fun about just sort of clipping faces of your dice, slapping on new ones, and being like, of your dice, wait, stop it, damn it. And just rolling them and hoping you're going to get them. One of the things that makes us slightly different from deck builder is something we've discussed with regard to early on in Altiplano, is that you're not guaranteed to sort of get all of your things. Like in a deck builder, you will eventually work through your deck, so you know stuff is going to come up, but you're sort of like buying die faces on the hope that these things are going to get rolled, and they might never do. Like, you might sort of buy something that's really, really good and just never roll it for the remainder of the game. You're rolling the dice a fair bit over the course of it, so that you can make some reasonable assumptions about how much it will happen, but you're still at the whims of the dice, which makes it not exactly the most strategic game in the world, but it's just a ton of fun.
Wait a minute. More or less strategic than X-Nimt?
Perfect. That's the question that we've all been thinking. We've all had that on our mind.
Who can say?
Did you win?
I did not win. I actually did terribly at Dice Forge both times I played it, which I think is the sign of a great game to me. It's like I came stone last in both times I played it, but it was fun to play. Like, there's something dumb about just rolling your two dice and hoping you get the magic combination. That's because at some point I had a ×3 multiplier on one die and 5 points on the other die, and I wanted, okay, I'm going to roll both of these definitely and get 15 points, and that's going to be amazing. And that never happens. Obviously, that never happens because you'd be an idiot to think that would happen, but you still hope it happens. And that's Dice Forge.
Have you ever heard of the phrase "stone last"?
I have, because I listen to a lot of like soccer podcasts and stuff like that, so I'm familiar. But
The
I knew-
Queen's English.
That's right. That's
Pretty-
right.
So the internet went out in Neelan's house. And Neelan, what did you have to reset?
The router, yeah, it makes routes to the internet.
Are you a contractor?
Roto-Rooter?
I think
You
that's
even-
rotor. I don't even know.
What? Roto-Rooter?
Anyway,
It is.
Wait, I this is entirely lost on me. What are we trying to say?
We're trying to say Roto-Rooter.
well,
What is a
it's-
rotor?
I mean, it's a router. You're saying the word right.
I know. Well, I'm saying the word right, but what is a rotor router? No one's explained what a rotor router is.
Do you know Roto-Rooter?
It'll be on your citizenship test. So,
So
we can't
that.
disclose that.
we're
You're not
Duty
allowed
bound.
to tell me. Yeah,
when
Fair
we
enough.
got our birth certificate, it kind of said.
Don't disclose it. Yeah.
Whatever you do. I like Dice Forge. I've only played it once a while back, but I remember making one of my 2 dice like a really strong one. Like I added all the custom faces to one die, and I remember just like banking on that one, and that was like a thrill each time. Yeah.
A couple of caveats I want to make is that it is a game that sort of seemed to maybe be close to wearing out its welcome in just the base set. There's not a whole lot to it in terms of variability, but I believe that there are a bunch of expansions for this already, which if they're adding new cards, adding new die faces, giving you more options, you kind of want that Dominion-esque make it feel different every single time you play it. And I don't think there's quite enough in the base box for that, but it's super close. And I think with some added expansions, it could be there. That's Dice Forge.
I was gonna say once Neelan stops being so selfish and only playing this children's game with his children, that I might get to try it.
All right. Well, then, Kellen, what did you play?
So I played an adult game for adults, and this is pronounced Gulo Gulo.
Gulo Gulo.
Gulo Gulo. Gulo Gulo is a very serious, very important game, a dexterity game, perhaps the most mature dexterity game of all, where there is a bowl.
It's a nest. It's clearly a
There is a nest full of
Neelan's into chicken, so he.
there is a nest full of Gulo Gulo eggs. And nestled in between all of those eggs of different colors and different sizes is what do they call it?
The egg.
Egg alarm?
Egg alarm, yes.
Yeah,
egg alarm.
nestled between those is a stick with an egg on top, and it's the egg alarm. And the problem is that when you put your big, grubby Gulo Gulo fingers into this nest, you jostle it around, and that stick falls. And if that stick hits the ground, you go back. You go back to the beginning, or you go back to a different color. So essentially what you're doing on your turn is you're trying to get to the nest. You're trying to get the purple egg, which is hidden in that nest. And each turn you have a little bit of a decision on what you want to pull based on how much you want to press your luck. We don't need to get into how you do it because it's so simple and silly, but essentially it's, do I want to go for broke and get the egg that's right underneath the egg? What? The egg
alarm.
The egg alarm. Or do I want to play it safe? And you're moving along your...
Gulo Gulo.
Oh, that's a Gulo Gulo?
That's a Gulo
Yeah.
Gulo, yeah.
Do they lay the eggs in the
No.
nest?
No, you're stealing the
You're
eggs
stealing
from
the
the
eggs.
nest.
You're murdering.
Why would you steal
You're
your own eggs,
It's
Kellen?
a serious game. You're murdering the
God, you're
eggs.
butchering the theme here.
It's also tough, yeah, because the Gulo Gulo to have an egg that large would be
difficult.
it would be difficult. Some may say that this is a game, to teach children how to grab onto little objects and to help with their manual dexterity. But I would say unto you, no. Gulo Gulo was awesome. We had a great time. This has been on my list of want to play dexterity games for a long time. I think it's great. What do you guys think of Gulo Gulo?
Fantastic. It's so simple and so silly, but that's the perfect realm it lives in, where it's just light and silly enough that the things you're doing feel ridiculous, but it's funny every single time you sort of trip over the egg alarm, because then sometimes you have these grabs where you're sort of trying to, get an egg that's buried underneath, and you sort of have to shove a bunch of stuff to the side, and then the alarm tips over and maybe doesn't quite hit the ground. It gets pinned by another egg, and those moments are great. It's funny, it's silly, it's goofy, it's so easy to explain. It's good.
Just add trash talk. I implore you, if you play Gulo Gulo, trash talk, because it makes it so much better.
I think one review I read of it, I think many, many years ago, that I thought was interesting and relevant is that it naturally balances against children because adults have giant fingers.
Right.
And so little kids are able to get in there, and I mean, I wouldn't know anything about this because my hands are so large, but But little kids are able to actually grab the egg that they need out of the nest, and so that self-balances against the adults whose brains have matured and they're big brains. But I have both big hands and big brains.
I thought you were talking up the virtues of your dainty hands while playing.
Childlike fingers.
That's right. You said, you guys are going down because of my childlike dainty fingers, I believe was the quote.
At no point did I say that. That is not true. Gulo Gulo is great. It's always good to have a dexterity game like this that you can just be exceedingly silly with. But if you're not willing to be silly, then maybe you'll want to play a real children's game, Dice Forge.
And finally, I played a game I played before, but it was nice to revisit, Millennium Blades. It's a game that tries to emulate the collectible card game scene. So sort of like think Magic the Gathering or Yu-Gi-Oh! I don't know what else is popular. Is that popular? Is Yu-Gi-Oh! Still a popular collectible card game?
Pokemon?
Is Pokemon? I guess they are.
Pokemon is substantially more popular than Yu-Gi-Oh!
But in terms of tournaments also?
Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
I feel that's going through like a second wave right now. Especially.
Okay, well, that aside, so what you're trying to do in Millennium Blades is you're constructing decks and you're taking them to 3 tournaments and you're scoring points for doing well in these tournaments versus the other players at the table. It tries to emulate this collectible card game scene in the deck building phases. So there's 3 deck building phases that come before the actual tournament phases. What you're doing in the deck building phase is there's a large array of cards in this game. This game is chock full of cards. There's literally, I'm sure there's at least 1,000 cards. The main stack of cards in this game is towers. You have to worry about its structural soundness because it's such a high deck. What you're doing is you're buying and selling cards to this like array that represents a store, and you're doing it during a 7-minute time session. So there's a frantic buying and selling cards back to the store, and other players can buy your cards. You can trade cards with other players, and you're buying these cards face down, which is supposed to emulate buying like booster packs. And during these 7-minute sessions, of which you have 3, you're trying to figure out if the cards you've bought synergize with the cards you have. And there's also metas that pop up for each of the tournaments. So again, emulating the idea that in collectible card games, there is a in vogue way to play. And so you're trying to build decks that are matching these like in vogue constructions. And so you're building your decks, and then you're going into the actual tournament phase, which is sort of like its own game where you're playing 6 cards one at a time, and they can combo off of each other, again, emulating the deck building idea where you're trying to get combos. At the end of these tournaments, whoever scores the most points wins the tournament, gets the most victory points. You're doing this 3 times. Each subsequent tournament, the winner scores more victory points, so you're trying to build your deck, but also build with an eye towards having the best deck at the end of the game. It is certainly a unique game. This idea of trying to have this collectible card game universe in a box is one that is quite unique. And so there's certainly a novelty and a allure in that. However, in my second game of it, it did feel, and this sort of dovetails nicely into our discussion, it did feel a little bit too long, a little bit too clunky, and the actual tournament itself felt a little too plain for everything that you sort of envision when you think of like a collectible card game board game. You sort of envision this like really interesting buying, selling cards, opening booster packs, and there's touches of that, but it doesn't quite hit the mark for me. And yet I'm still holding on to my copy just because it's such a unique theme and such a unique idea. What did you guys think? If you've played it, what did you guys think of Millennium Blades?
I played this actually a while ago with Kellen a few years ago. I believe you used to have a copy of it. I think you nailed it. Like, I think I admire Millennium Blades a lot more than I like it. I think the premise is such a good idea. As someone that's tried to sort of chase the collectible card game Dragon for like a long time, like I played Magic the Gathering a lot in high school and I've never been able to like live up to that sort of high. It's so appealing. Like the idea that you're sort of, you have money, you're buying booster packs, you sort of build a little deck in the case. That's such a neat, novel idea. I had the same sort of feeling that you had, which is that the actual tournament, the actual game playing part of the card game, I thought was really kind of dull, and just especially after the build up of collecting the cards, just felt like a big come down that was a bit disappointing. I really wanted to like this, and it just didn't really work for me the time I played it.
Trading card games, but in board game format, is something I am also super interested in, and have almost made like a Magic Cube, for example, to play with you guys, which is a format where you basically make fake booster packs with 500 cards and then everybody drafts them. There's no money involved at that point, and so you're having a Magic the Gathering night, but everyone's building their own deck. And so I was extremely, extremely excited for Millennium Blades. But I think it's telling, Mark, that you as a Mr. Trade Master man are unsure of it, or unsure what you think of it, because the game is supposed to be about that trade, the rush, the hunt of finding stuff. I think it leans way too heavily into the side of trading card games, like the front half, like the buying of packs and the opening of booster packs and the selling of cards. That's 80% of the game, and then the other 20% is playing the cards, when the fun for me is playing the cards. And essentially, when you get to the playing the trading card game, it's more of what order will I play these cards in, and in some cases it doesn't even matter, depending on the deck. But that mix of those two phases is fascinating. It's super interesting. It's trying things that have not been done before, which I really admire and respect, but I just don't get it. I don't get where the fun is, and it's so cumbersome to set up and figure out, and these packs of cards and shuffle this and trade that. And the first half of each round is so complicated, what you can trade, what you can sell, how many you can put here or there, and how much money you're getting. And everyone is just trying to make sure I felt like I was breaking rules that I didn't even remember, because you have a timer and you're kind of freaking out.
One of the rules is in the rule book is like you'll break the rules and it's going to happen. A couple things that I think it's sort of, and again, I've never was into collectible card games. I did play Spellfire for a while. That's one that is
just as popular as Pokemon.
But the two things I think are missing from the rush and the draw of collectible card games that are missing from Millennium Blades is one, sort of a knowledge of what you could be getting. I feel like part of the draw of collectible card games is like knowing, oh, there's this card that's available and like I want it. That might come with more games of Millennium Blades. You might know what cards are like the rares that are the ones that you want, but for me, in the two plays I've had, it was just sort of like hunting. Is this any good? Is this going to synergize? Maybe, maybe not. And I didn't feel great about it. Even the cards that, there's a little icon that represents whether or not the card is rare or ultra rare or common or whatever. But I didn't find that much correlation between that number and how good the card was. So even when I was pulling like an ultra rare card, I think called legendary cards, they didn't feel like, oh, this is super powerful. I can't wait to use this in the game. And the other thing I think it's missing that you find in collectible card games that Millennium Blade lacks is confrontation between you and the other players. A lot of Magic Gathering, you're trying to destroy the other wizard or that you're playing against. And there is a aspect in Millennium Blades called clashing, where you're fighting your opponent, but it's such a small part of the game. There's such a small percentage of cards that allow you to clash or are created for clashing that I think in our game, we had a 3-player game, I think we clashed 3 or 4 times in the entire game, and they felt sort of incidental and the stakes were quite low on them. So that excitement of like beating the other player or causing damage to the other player, at least in that game, felt very neutered and very boring, for lack of a better term. So yeah, that was my game of Millennium Blades. All right, before we get into our discussion on time and length,
the fourth dimension.
Thank you for trying to save my terrible joke. We are going to read a review. Again, one of the best things you can do for us, if you love us, and you do, is to write a review on Apple Podcasts or Facebook or anything that allows you to review us. Review us there. Tell a friend. Tell your friend to review them. Tell 2 friends. Tell them to tell 2 friends.
And if they keep telling 2 friends.
That's right.
Is this a multi-level marketing scheme?
No, it's don't say.
Yeah.
That. It's not that.
Don't use the word pyramid.
Yeah, that's right.
A triangle shaped.
Yes.
Yes.
This is a triangle shaped, not scheme. This is a triangle shaped opportunity of wealth creation for you to do. So do that. Anyway, let's read one of these reviews. This comes from Crazy El Camino, who I believe is on our Discord. That's a great name, Crazy El Camino. I like it. The title of this is Get the Good Stuff. These 3 guys hash out what's to like and what's not to like about board games and gaming in general. Opinionated and entertaining. Best board game podcast out there. And who wants to quarrel with Crazy El Camino? So that does it. We are the best board game podcast out there.
Fact.
All right, let's get into it. Time. What is time? Time is on my side, to quote the Rolling Stones. So, game length. What makes a game too long? What makes a game too short?
I just love the idea of you saying, Neelan, tell us your general thoughts on time, the fourth dimension.
Okay, so we're talking about game length, and specifically, can a game be too long, too short, and how that sort of enhances or detracts from our enjoyment of games. So, Kellen, what is your opinion on time? It's a flat circle.
It's a precious thing. Never waste it. I think that's Willy Wonka. Who can say? So game length is something that I always compare to novels. I've read a lot of books on how to write fiction, and there's always this idea that a novelist will try or want to have this giant preamble at the beginning, setting up who their character is, a dream sequence, and then they wake up out of bed, and then the first interesting thing actually happens in chapter 4.
Right.
But you need chapter 1, 2, and 3, to know why chapter 4 matters. And then a lot of editors kill and cut and trim and get to that action because the thing that's going to grip and excite and get you into the game starts at chapter 4. And then at the end of a novel, I actually personally find that novels end and I want them to keep going.
Right.
I want, wait, no, he just got on the throne, wait, like they just fell in love, and imagining what comes after is part of the appeal of that ending where it leaves you yearning for more. So I think it's really easy to see how this relates to board games. I think that, for example, as we've talked about in the intro to a novel, if a board game has openings, has moves that you always must take, why don't you just start at the second or the third turn once you've already made that move? I think two great examples of this are Cthulhu Wars and Food Chain Magnate. Now, in both games, there are some varieties to what you can do on your opening turn, but within 80, 90% of the game, you're going to be doing one of two things. And then after that, on subsequent turns, suddenly you have dozens of options. And so maybe that type of game should start at the most unique place for options to take place. That's what I think about sort of the beginning of the game.
The most pertinent point for me is that you always want a game to feel like you wanted to do more, is maybe my most succinct way of saying it. You don't want to feel like you sort of rode out past the high, rode out the game, and the game sort of peters out at the point. I think that's a hard thing to do because it's almost like it's fundamentally against what most people think when they play games. A lot of people describe this about most engine building games where you'll get to the end and be like, oh, I wish I could have done this thing. I sort of was just getting going, right? But that's, to me, that's always like the best possible place to end. You sort of want to end just past the high, like never past the point where that high gets stale.
Right.
And it's a thing that most games don't do well, unfortunately. I would almost rather have a game that doesn't quite get you to the point where you're like you've been firing on all cylinders, and then just end, and then
you see the horizon, but you're
never quite get there.
Right,
exactly.
Right.
Anticipation is always much more interesting than fulfillment, right? And I think that's a rare quality in a game.
Yeah, I agree. I think when it comes to a game being slightly too long or slightly too short, the better option is almost always slightly too short, or your perception, it perceived to be slightly too short than slightly too long. And I think I'm not a guy who shies away from long games. I don't mind long games. I think sometimes long games, the length of a game and the fact that it is long can add to the epic nature of the game. Like one reason one of my favorite games is Dominant Species is the length. For me, it enhances the idea that you are these like types of creatures vying for control of the planet. If that game took 45 minutes, it could be a great game. That's fine. But something about it taking so long, you feel like you've been in a war. I mean, and the fact that it is a good game is obviously paramount, because if it was a terrible game, of course I wouldn't want to play a 5-hour, terrible game. But it's a great game that feels like a war of attrition, a war of like survival, and just that length is not always a instant turnoff to me. That said, I think with all things being equal, I do appreciate games that are on the short side, just because it allows you to play more games, and time is valuable.
It's funny because Dominant Species actually might be my go-to example of a game that I think is too long.
Sure,
in
and
that
I can
way.
see that.
And the thing is, we spoke about this at length a very long time ago when we sort of hashed out one of the best episodes of the show I think we ever did was just the two of us alone in the room talking about Dominant Species. Kellen wasn't there. But Dominant Species, I think, for me, like, is a very heavy game that would work for me a lot better if it was playing out over a slightly shorter period of time. Like I definitely got to the point where, given how heavy it is, I was just exhausted by the end of it. And I get what you're saying a little bit, that's maybe part of the point of it, that it feels like this very long, drawn out thing that just feels epic in scope.
Right.
But yeah, that's actually a really solid example of a game for me that maybe was too long.
And I get that. I get that argument for sure.
I think that, there is obviously the subjective question for all of us, and everything we say on this podcast is usually objective when coming out of the red microphone.
Well,
but
that's objectively wrong. Boom.
But I think that one of the things that makes long games feel too long is when what you're doing in round 1 is substantially the same as what you're doing in round 8 or 9 or 12. And I think engine builders are a great example of how you've dealt with that problem, is that there is a clear early game, mid game, and late game. So one of my top 50 games of all time, New Angeles, is way too long. And why it feels that way, or one of the main reasons it feels that way, is there's 3 rounds, and each round is like over an hour long, but they're all the same. It almost soft resets, and then you do it again, and then you do it again. And so the perception of that length is there isn't much exponential growth that you experience in an engine builder where the end feels different than the beginning. And so suddenly what might be the perfect length, because I would love to argue and backstab and fight people in New Angeles for 4 hours, as long as that experience has enough change throughout that experience that the early game and the mid game and the late game have some kind of tempo shift or some different thing that I'm thinking about. And New Angeles has some of that, so that's not to say that there's nothing there, but I think that's what makes a game feel too long to me.
While we're talking about games that are too long, it feels like a chance for me to bring up a couple of games that I think are too long. And for me, when we're talking about games that are too long, these jumped to mind, these 3 games, but I feel with 2 of them, there are house rule fixes. I don't even know if there's house rules. They may even be part of the regular rules. So I'll just bring them up. Formula D is a game that I like, but if you play 3 laps of it, that's too long for me. So I've always played this game playing 1 lap, and at the end of that felt like a sufficient experience. I've never had any, even though I had a lot of fun playing that 1 lap, and I can theoretically see why playing more laps would be fun because there'd be more strategy. I never felt like I wish this race was another lap. I much rather would play just another single race that was a single lap.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's the right way to do it, is play 1 lap and play multiple races.
Yes, right, exactly. Another game I think that fits that subset of games that are too long but are fixable is Robo Rally. Robo Rally is a game where you're racing your robot to flags and you're trying to hit all the flags in order. So it's a race game in that respect, but there's a lot of randomness, and that's the fun of the game. Like, you're programming your robots, but you're sort of at the mercy of how the other players have programmed the robots and how the board is sort of shifting, which is one of the conceits of the game. But we've only ever played this where you have to hit 1 or 2 flags, and those games are almost too long in and of themselves. I can't imagine playing Robo Rally with like 4 or 5 flags. It would just take forever, and I can just see getting really tired of it really quickly. So that's another game that, even in the shortened version, feels a little too long, but at least can be sort of fixed. And, it's a game that I enjoy, but only in that circumstance. You guys have anything that pops into mind when it comes to these games that are...
Yeah, King of Tokyo is too long for what it delivers for me. I play with a variant where every energy roll you get gets you double energy, so you're unlocking cards just faster and getting to the wackiness and the chaos. I feel like relative to the depth of the mechanisms in King of Tokyo, which is essentially a Yahtzee variant, it sometimes takes 45 minutes or an hour if someone is healing up. So all I want to do is ramp up into crazy punching. So King of Tokyo for me is an example of a game that just feels too long when you play it normally.
Yeah. And finally, the last game that popped in my head when it comes to games too long is one that I haven't figured a fix for, and I'm not really sort of inclined to find one.
All right, I'll help you.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Citadels.
Yeah.
Citadels is a game that there's just so much downtime from player to player. This is a game where one of the aspects of the game is you're selecting a role, and when you select a role, you're handed a deck of cards that represents roles, and you select one and you pass it down. And as you're selecting and passing it down, all the other players have nothing to do. There's not really much pre-planning to do. You're just at the mercy of everybody selecting the role. And even when you reveal the roles, it's a very mechanical process that just takes a long time.
I like this example because it's an example of a game that's not like, it's not long in absolute length.
Right.
It's very long relative for how long it should be.
Yeah. I played this game a couple times. The last time I played it, it was with a lot of new players, and it's not a very complicated game, so I thought I could introduce it. And the hidden roles thing is sort of fun and exciting for people who aren't used to board games, so I was thinking it might work. But it was just took so long between turns that we just abandoned it midway through, because I could just tell people were just losing interest. So yeah, that's the one that's a little too long. Citadels.
Downtime is frequently a big contributor to this problem for me, because like Five Tribes is the example that comes to mind, where like you can't do much on the turns where someone, when you're watching someone else play, because the board state changes so fundamentally between their and your turn, and all you can do is just watch them sort of overanalyze all the possible moves that they have, and like that's bad. Like you're not even able to sort of effectively use that downtime in any sort of meaningful way. That feels like a really egregious problem that makes a game feel so much longer than it is, and that's always been my problem with Five Tribes. I want it to be over like halfway through.
It's funny because whenever people, and that is a completely justified argument against Five Tribes, and one of the reasons why I haven't played it as much as I might want to otherwise. I always wonder like what a timer would do if you just introduce.
I think that would be the way to play it. Yeah. Honestly, of just giving everyone like 30 seconds.
That might be the only. I mean, honestly, that might be like in my head when I'm thinking about playing Five Tribes and then playing Five Tribes with a timer. Playing Five Tribes with a timer might be the only way I would play it.
I would agree with that. Maybe, yeah. Because I've never tried it, but I would like to.
It goes from being an unappealing proposition to an appealing one. I would be excited about playing Five Tribes with like a 1 minute timer or something like that.
Right.
Or 30-second timer. All right, so now we've talked about long games for a bit. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Games that are too short or games that are just shorter in length. What do we feel about that in general?
I mean, in general, I love shorter games.
Yeah.
I think that it got a little silly for a few years with some of the micro games where the game has 16 cards and takes 12 minutes and it's a love letter ripoff that's not good.
Yeah.
And those micro games just felt so insubstantial that it was like, why did we even do this? And luckily now they're all making roll and writes instead of that, so that's good. But I think the more interesting thing to talk about is a game like Agricola. A game of Agricola is a long Euro game, but the engine ends before you can do everything. Before you get to feed your people, before you have all the vegetables and the cows and the horses that you want. And that's what makes the game so good. And yet, I'll bet you, and I haven't looked, but I'll bet you if you go online and look, people will be wishing that Agricola was one round longer. I just needed one more round and then everything would be taken care of.
Yeah.
But it was similar to what Neelan had mentioned earlier. If you arrive somewhere in a game and you're winning, and then there's 2 more rounds, and all that happens is everyone catches up to you in those last 2 rounds, and everyone's then hovering, within 3 or 4 points of each other. That's a game that's too long, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Not necessarily, but that is an example of how a game could be too long. And Agricola forces you to make sacrifices and choices, and then forces you to start it all over again, because you want to see how you could build it out differently and see if you could do it more efficiently, faster. In some ways, it reminds me a little bit of another video game parallel. The Dota genre of video games, the MOBA, as they call them now. Sometimes you want to play around with all the cool weapons and armor and stuff that you can't get until the late game. And so you have to play 30 minutes before you can mess around with the late game cool toys,
Yeah.
And that's part of the appeal, but that's also annoying because you can't practice that late game without playing the early and the mid game.
Right.
And they've actually introduced modes called ARAM, which I think have negatively impacted these games, because what it allows you to do is play a late game from the very beginning. And that demystifies and takes away some of that build-up that you had to get there to that end game. And so part of what makes an end of a good long board game so exciting is that, it's taken you so long to get there.
Right.
And you've got to figure out how to do with these magical powers that you suddenly have and the cards that you have that are so much stronger than everything that you had before. And what do I do? It's innovation at the very end of the game. What are those cards going to do?
Right.
And that's the fun. That's the drama.
Yeah, I struggle to think of a really good solid example for this, but Indian Summer is a game that we spoke about last week that felt like a pretty good candidate for this, where we finished our game shorter than any of us expected it to be after 15 to 20 minutes, and you had the feels oh, I was just getting going in this. I really wanted to keep doing this, and I don't know if that would bear out over playing a lot more. I can't imagine it would slow down in any meaningful sense. But yeah, that definitely struck me as a game where you want to keep doing the puzzle for longer, but your grid just fills so quickly.
Yeah. For me, when it came to thinking of games in terms of on the shorter end of the spectrum, again, I thought of one that was just right, and then one that I think is too short. The one that is just right is Marco Polo. Marco Polo ends, you just feel I'm right there. I'm right at the edge. It worked so hard to get across the map and to build this thing up, and it ends every single time. It just feels like it ends one round too short, and there's that yearning that you're talking about. That I can see it. I can see what I'm building, and I just every time just fall one step short, and it just makes you want to play it again. Yeah,
that's definitely one of the examples I had in my head of a game, because I remember so distinctly playing it for the first time and thinking wait, what? No, that's it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
but in a fantastic way, you described. It's just you made you almost want to jump right back into it, which is impressive for a game that's over an hour long.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the other one that is, I think, too short that I don't really enjoy, and this may just be a function of just not enjoying the game itself, but Above and Below is a game that felt like it ended a couple rounds too early. And I think that people on Board Game Geek have actually complained about this or mentioned that they've a lot of house ruling to add a round or two. It's a game where there's a lot of randomness. It's a narrative sort of game where on your turn, you're given a narrative little paragraph, and you select one of two routes, and the thing that you get is sort of arbitrary. There's no way to know which is the right decision. And yet, it felt like a game that ended too quickly. Maybe that was also a function of not enjoying the game, but Above and Below was a game that felt like it ended too quickly.
Just a side anecdote here. One of the things that I'm always extremely dubious of in board games is variable lengths. This just strikes me as module-based expansions or movies with 7 different versions. One of my favorite games of all time, Archipelago, you can choose between short, medium, and a long-length game, and the difference between the two is hours in length. So then the question becomes, well, what is this balanced around? The cost of building a hut has not changed. Acquiring bananas is the same in the short, medium, and long game, so what are you doing to the balance when you can make the game short, medium, or long? And it feels like there's a sort of a passing of the buck onto the player. It's well, we don't know which one is best per se, but maybe you can choose.
Or maybe we built it one way with something in mind, but we're afraid to tell you, so you pick which one you want. Yeah.
But the game length is something that designers do change up to the last minute. We've seen pre-production copies of games where the length of the end game or how many victory points you have to get changes right up until the last minute. And so these designers have, unique systems and mechanisms in place, and then they sort of just feel ski, it should end about here, and that's a very interesting thought that maybe there is a hidden gem that should be 2 rounds shorter or 2 rounds longer, and it would actually be an amazing experience or a top 20 board game if only they had figured out how to stick the length.
That's interesting.
Speaking about variable length, what do you guys think of the way that Food Chain Magnate does this, where the players collectively decide how long the game is going to be? That always struck me as a very interesting mechanic, but I have this nagging fear of the thing that you're describing, whereas there is an ideal length for this game, and we're sort of just going to half arbitrarily figure out what that is. I understand the appeal of it, which is that you might be planning for a short, medium, or long-term strategy, but it always just feels like the same things. There's probably a length that's ideal for this game, and we're just going to arbitrarily sort of vote on what we think it is.
Yeah, I mean, for me, in that specific case, I, for whatever reason, just trust that is part of the design, that playing for a long game or playing for a short game is part of the strategy. I might be wrong about that, but that's just what struck me about Food Chain Magnate.
I think that Food Chain Magnate is so deterministic overall in so many of the other choices that you need some fuzziness somewhere,
right?
And that gives it to you. But I mean, I have the exact same misgivings. That was my second example. Even though I think it's baked into the system, it's part of gameplay where Archipelago is done outside of the game, so it is fundamentally different.
So that's going to do it for our discussion on game length. But before we go, let's go around the table and talk about what we're looking forward to in the upcoming week of board gaming. I'll start. I recently got a copy of the Hollenspiel game 4X, which is a game that I've been interested in breaking out. It plays on the 4X board gaming term, but instead of being a game about exploration and extermination and all that, this is a foreign exchange game. So it's a very mathy game that I've heard really good things about, and I'm very interested in playing it. So I'm looking forward to playing 4X.
I'm still working my way through all the games I recently acquired, and then I did the dumb thing of buying a couple more. So, I have a few small games I'm looking to play. Chimera being one of them, Fairy Tale, which I just sort of picked up on the cheap. I'm looking forward to playing those. But also the Detective City of Angels Kickstarter is fulfilling soon, and that is a crime Sherlock Holmes consulting detective style game where one player is actively working against you solving it. So that seems an interesting idea with an LA Noire style, LA Confidential theme to it. So yeah, that seems really cool.
We've been talking about it for so long, and now that my little brother is in town, it is the summer of diplomacy.
Dun, dun, dun.
We will gather the 7 best valiant
From around the world.
from around the Los Angeles area. That includes the 3 of us plus my little brother Paxton, and we will be playing Diplomacy, the Friendship Killer.
Right. So find out when that game is, ask us on the Discord, and then know that will be the end of Board Game Barrage.
That it will come to a spectacular end, and then the next week, all you will hear is the blue tank talking to herself on the show.
So that's going to do it for the show. As always, you can find us on any form of social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all that kind of stuff. You can email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com. Join us on the Discord, and you can hear us talk about all these games that are too long and too short or just right, and throw in a couple of your own. What did we miss? Let us know. That is at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. Give us a review. Again, the way to make money is review us. Have 2 of your friends review us, and tell 2 of their friends review us, and just wait for the money to roll in, because it's going to happen.
If you are going to be at Gen Con or Shucks, and you are a publisher, you are a listener of the podcast, and you just want to talk to us about games, you want to get together, you want to do anything, please reach out to us. You can do that at the Discord or at our Gmail at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com.
Yes. And finally, a big thank you, as always, to Heart Society for the intro and outro song, What's on Your Mind, Kid? That's going to do it. See you later.
Bye-bye.
So long.
So, game length. No, that's dumb. Sorry. So as far as time, okay. Time, yeah, I know. I want to make it important and profound. Okay, so that's gonna do it. Okay. So that's gonna do it.